right. Welcome, everybody. This is the second of the new feature of Discussions with Dr. D, which is part of our Deeper Dive series. It's designed to give short introductions and maybe some context to a topical issue going on in the global economy that affects Canada and then the wider world around us. And today, one of the ones we're going to focus on, or the main one we're going to focus on, is the return of what is called geoeconomics, and it's paired often with this idea of geopolitics. Now, most of us probably who pay attention have noticed that the world's a bit more dicey than it's used to be. It seems that countries are, more in conflict, particularly on the economic front. And economic means seems to be one of the ways that countries are working around to try to inflict pain or suffering on other countries or to induce them to do things that they wouldn't always or wouldn't want to do. Now that's kind of what we're looking at here is to try to understand when and where a particular country will choose to try to do that and how effectively will its actions ultimately be. And at the end of this little deeper dive, we're going to also take a look at some of the academic literature around it where you can go and find out some more information about this kind of very topic. So that's what we're going to do today for the next 8.5, 9 minutes, and hopefully it'll be worth your time. So here we go. What is geoeconomics, and where did it come from? Now, it's interesting for most of us who have spent our working lives more or less in my age cohort. We've never been really exposed to this, at least not to the degree that it happened in the past. There are some exceptions to that general statement, but generally we've lived in an era of globalization where countries and governments worked exclusively to try to lower barriers to international trade, international investment, and in some cases the movement of people as well. The idea being that the more economic links we could forge, the safer and more prosperous we would all be. Now, much of this idea came out of the end of the Cold War, and during the 1990s, a two-word term came to be popularized to talk about this. It was called the Washington Consensus, which was this idea that if you lowered trade barriers and opened investment and kept taxes low and did a bunch of things that were economically seemed to make a lot of sense, at least to the people purveying it, the world economy would grow, but more importantly, people would become more interdependent upon each other for economic welfare, and that we would all collectively gain rapidly. And that was a nice theory, and in some cases, it certainly worked. I mean, over the last 3 decades, the world economy has increased markedly, as has the wealth enjoyed not just by the developed world, but also the emerging market world. But the benevolency of the idea behind the Washington Consensus was never fully embraced, and in some places it was never embraced at all. The idea that countries would mutually cooperate right now for economic gain and would do so forever and would not keep an eye to this notion of what we call relative gains, whether things are benefiting another country more than us, even though we both do benefit, someone gaining more than me, was a bit naive. And other folks started to say a couple of things. One is the Washington Consensus was really good at keeping the United States on top of the economic gain, and it seemed somewhat ironic that the country arguing for this was the one that's going to probably benefit the most from it. But it also became clear over the course of the last couple of decades that not everybody played by the same rules, and that the idea or the goal many countries have was not necessarily to foster an interdependent global economy where people are dependent on each other, but to try to use economic means to gain economic strength and to use the tools and the openings that they saw to be able to make their country stronger at the expense of somebody else, which is really kind of the heart of what geoeconomics is. To put it simply, as David Baldwin does in a reference I'll give you a little bit later, what it basically means is that foreign policy or economic activity that the state condones by its own actors becomes a subset of an instrument of foreign policy, that you are using economic tools to achieve foreign policy objectives, which may or may not have anything to do with economic welfare. Often they are designed to do other things, which means that that's what companies should keep in mind, and others in the economic sphere, is that governments are making decisions on economic activity, not in the sense of trying to make the whole world more economically beneficial, but what foreign policy objective can I achieve, and can economic means allow me to do it? And will I be willing and able to upset the costs? Now, the classic example that's going on right now is, of course, Mr. Trump and tariffs. Mr. Trump has convinced himself that the rest of the world, by running persistent trade surpluses with the United States, is somehow not playing fair. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about free trade in a later deep dive, but the fact that he's convinced himself of it means in his mind he's justified in doing the types of things that he is doing. So remember, the idea is it's not really, you may not agree with the overall foreign policy objective, or it may be a wrong one, or it may not actually work the way that people at Emergent thinks it should. But that's what's going on, is that there's a foreign policy objective being done, in this case for tariffs. It's designed to, in Mr. Trump's mind, to lower trade surpluses of other countries and to somehow reinvigorate the American manufacturing capacity and to stop people from taking advantage, as he sees it, of the United States. So that's one tool, right? And for economic and geopolitics, there are a number of tools that one can use. Some are what we would call defensive, which is basically preventing others from doing business with you. Some are more targeted, embargoes, tariffs on specific people and not others, sanctions, designed essentially to inflict certain parts of pain on an adversary's economy to induce them to do something they otherwise would not, or to stop them from doing something they otherwise would, which is the definition of political power in an economic context. Now, when we think of this, there's really two big countries in the world that are obviously doing a lot of this right now. And one of them is, of course, is the United States. Now, the United States has an enormous amount of built up advantages in the global economy that allow them to play the geoeconomics card quite well. And tariffs is only a very clear, blunt instrument, but they use others and have used others for what they thought to be, in their mind, good reasons. Probably a couple of others that you'll hear about, or what are a couple of others, is the use of the American dollar in the American banking system. For example, people are forced to use and hold the US dollar as part and parcel of their reserve currency, which gives the US dollar enormous import on how international business is conducted. And if countries lose access to or are inhibited by their ability to trade freely in US dollars, then that's going to hurt. Similarly, there's the banking system, a system of clearance of payments, being access to international banking regulation, such as the SWIFT payment system, denying that access to that system, or denying access to the US American market more generally, whether in trade or investment or in others, is an awfully big stick. And not only can the US do that for an individual country, it can compel its own allies to do the same thing to that particular offending country. We are going to impose sanctions and embargoes on country X, and we expect Canada and the European Union and others to do the same thing, even if that violates their business interests, and even if that's in the pursuit of a foreign policy goal they never agreed to. So the US has lots of entrenched positions in the global economy that it's built up over the past 70 years or longer, that makes it a very big stick, and that others will have to weigh whether or not, agreeing with that stick is a better choice than trying to strike an independent economic zone. The other one, of course, is China. Now, China was starting in the year 2000 from a very relatively low starting point. Its economy was something like a tenth the size of the United States and had a billion plus people to worry about. But it was the country that Mr. Trump and others have argued took advantage of the Washington consensus openness to build up its economy as quickly and as powerfully as it could. And clearly, the idea behind that was not just to trade and create goods and services and make money. It was also to ensure that the Chinese economy grew and advanced and became a geopolitical rival to the United States. Now, rather than using that entrenched position and sort of using power to that entrenched position just to manipulate or challenge or motivate others to do certain things, China needed to create that position itself because it didn't have it. And one of the places that it looked was the places that the United States typically wasn't as serious about or didn't have as big of investment. And those were so-called emerging markets. Now, you may have heard of, for the last decade, a key term in this was the Belt and Road Initiative that China ran, which was designed specifically to build infrastructure in these emerging and developing markets, dams, ports, roads, other things, that would then foster relationships with China, primarily in terms of trade, that would increasingly link these emerging markets into the Chinese trading orbit. They would become enormously dependent on China for their exports and investments. And while this was often going under the radar, one of the places where that was most clearly evident is in this thing called critical minerals, which are often overwhelmingly sourced by African mines, copper, and other sorts of metals that are used in the energy transition. So the idea from China was to use a trade and increasingly an investment bloc to counteract the power of the United States and to ensure that it had access to what it needed. And going after the markets the United States perhaps didn't spend as much time in or found too challenging to make. Now, the final thing I'll say about those two final things I'll say. One is, will geoeconomics continue? And the answer is, oh, yeah, most likely. The reason being is that we are on, people would argue, kind of the verge of what was called the fourth industrial revolution. We have green energy transition technologies on the table. We have artificial intelligence and big data issues on the table. We have a whole bunch of new industries that are based primarily on science and technology and the application of knowledge. But they are also industries that kind of value scale. It's not like you're going to have hundreds of different small competitors. They would likely consolidate into a few big companies. And both the United States and China want their companies to be those companies. They want their industry to be that industry. Classic example right now, of course, is computer chips and NVIDIA and trying to ensure that the United States stays ahead in that really critical technology that drives virtually everything and elsewhere. So the act of shaping economic activity to achieve foreign policy objectives and enduring the costs. In Mr. Trump's case, tariffs are going to make things more expensive for the United States. In some cases, it's going to make alliances more difficult to manage as people disagree. It's going to make other countries suspicious of motives and other behavior that a particular country might do. But the idea that countries will sort of let the market work it out is not borne by historical evidence and is unlikely to be the way that the industries of the 21st century are going to be established and are going to be decided who's going to win and who is not. Now, for further reference, there's a couple of cool places you can take a look. The classic book is David Baldwin's Economic Statecraft, which is kind of an academic look at it. Mr. Robert D. Blackwell and Jennifer Harris wrote a book called War by Other Means that came out a number of years ago that take a look at China's particular efforts to be able to sew up and exert its economic power. And a more recent book that came out this summer, the summer of 2025, is a book called Choke Points, which talks about the U.S.'s use of economic levers to achieve its foreign policy objectives, with the specific cases of Iran, China, a couple of others, dawn into great detail. So those are places you can look to drill down a little bit more on all of these. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into what geoeconomics and economic warfare is. It's not going away, so maybe we'll have to reconvene again in another year to see where this particular story has gone. Thanks very much, everybody.